Was Jesus a socialist? Many socialists and communists claim that he was. Yet, if Jesus were a socialist, he could not have been a Christian. And yet, Jesus was the founder of Christianity. Let's take a look. This is Beyond the Cover with your host, Gary Benoit. And today we have with us Selwyn Duke, who wrote the cover story article in the April 10 issue of the New American Magazine entitled, Was Jesus a Socialist? Selwyn, welcome to the program.
Gary, great to be with you as always.
As always. Now, Selwyn, in saner times, it would have been ludicrous to have written an article entitled, Was Jesus a Socialist? Because the answer to that should be self-evident. Everyone should understand that he was not. But that's no longer true today, is it? Apparently such an article is necessary in today's age.
Yeah, it's really a sign of the times, Gary, the things that we actually have to debate. Is sex real? Can a boy become a girl just by willing it? And this is another case really like that. And it's interesting. Socialism has been failing for almost 200 years now. A lot of people think that it began with 1848 and the publication of the Communist Manifesto, but actually it dates back to at least 1825. And so with that history of failure, it has never succeeded. Socialists today need to rebrand themselves, so they're calling themselves democratic socialists. And they need a really good salesman. And what better salesman than Jesus? Hence the effort to brand him as a socialist. And I'll stop if you want to chime in. But basically what we see here are two claims that are made. One claim is that his early followers were socialists. And then the other claim, of course, is that he himself was a socialist. And I think we'll take the former first. Now, I know Senator Raphael Warnock, the senator from Georgia. And when I think about him, I think about that old Charlie Daniels song, The Devil Went Down to Georgia, looking for a soul to steal. And when he was not yet in office, he told his Ebenezer church flock that the early Christians were socialists. That was the claim he made. He said they held all things in common. And of course, he was quoting from Acts. Now, he's a reverend, so he should know better. But the thing that's deceptive about that is that, yes, it's true, they did hold all things in common. And we've seen that model replicated all throughout history. I mean, we have monks today who live in a communal manner and other communities. And in the 19th century, we had a lot of religious communes. Some endured for more than 100 years. But what's the difference? Well, remember, there was also a secular commune. And this is why I said that communism's or socialism's failure dates back to 1825. In that year, where Scottish reformer Robert Owen, who basically was a socialist of sorts, came to the United States and instituted a secular collectivist commune in a place he called New Harmony in Indiana. And his commune, though, unlike many of the religious ones, dissolved after only 4 years. Okay? Now, what's the difference? Well, there are two things. Raphael Warnock is wrong. Because for one thing, when you talk about these communes, you're talking about voluntary arrangements. That's very important. It's important not just from a moral standpoint, because you don't want the kind of coercion necessary to impose that upon a whole civilization, but from a practical standpoint, it just doesn't work otherwise. When you're talking about a commune, you're talking about a small group of very unusual people who have unusual motivations, which generally, in the case of the successful communes, are not very worldly. Okay? Now, the other thing that you'll see, and this illustrates why the religious communes often endured while the collectivist Robert Owen commune failed, is that there's the God factor. Okay? If you look at these communes, neither the religious ones nor Owens had the profit motive, right? But the religious ones had the God motive. Now, whatever you think of their ideology, or their theology, I should say, the bottom line is that if you think that you're being industrious for the glory of God, or maybe even if you think you're working your way into heaven, that's a mighty strong motivation. But Robert Owen's secular commune didn't have the profit motive, didn't have the God motive, so it failed. And we've seen that problem all throughout the history of socialism. Now, remember, too, when you talk about this, if you want to follow Raphael Warnock's thinking, well, you could talk about the family. The family is a socialist-like unit, Gary. After all, we've discussed this before, I know. It's from each according to his abilities, to each according to his means, or to each according to his needs. I'm sorry, I fumbled that a little bit. And the parents are basically an autocratic government. The kids, if there's a proper hierarchy, don't have a say. But the thing is, that's by and large a voluntary arrangement. And you cannot scale that to the wider society. That's another difference between what Warnock was talking about and socialism. To be socialism, it must be applicable to the wider society, because that's what Karl Marx and the other socialists had in mind. They didn't just say, oh, well, we think it would be a really good idea if a lot of people tried to live communally. No, they wanted this to be orchestrated by government from the top down. So to be socialism, it has to be scalable. But what we're looking at in those Christian communes is not scalable at all, not at all. So for those two reasons, has to be voluntary, has to be scalable. It simply does not work when applied to a nation. And Raphael Warnock is wrong. Now, maybe we can move on to Jesus, but I'll shut up and let you have a say here.
Okay. Well, I think that's very helpful, what you said, that difference between being voluntary and not being voluntary, because obviously Senator Warnock, he wants to use the power of government. He wants to use the power of government to take from some in order to give to others. And of course, he claims that would be for the betterment of the people. The good of the people. And of course, he would claim that he wants to help the poor, he wants to help those in need and whatnot. But when Jesus walked the earth, that's not what Jesus was saying. Jesus was not going to Caesar and saying, Caesar, I want you to raise the taxes. And I want you to take from some to give to others. Take out of the pockets of the people and give to those who really need it. Jesus wasn't saying that at all. When he was talking about charity and he was talking about love, he was talking about things that people would do voluntarily. And actually, what Warnock is talking about is the opposite of that, is it not? Because the government steps in and government provides what government is calling charitable to help our fellow man. Is government not relieving the responsibilities of others to do what Jesus talked about in terms of being charitable?
Well, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And in my article, I quote the journalist P.J. O'Rourke. He had something to say about this. I can paraphrase. He said that big government programs make a mockery of charity. Again, I'm paraphrasing. He said, a politician who supports such programs is saying that he's willing to do good with other people's money. And a citizen who supports such programs is saying that he's willing to do good, quote unquote, if a gun is held to his head.
Right.
And of course, again, that makes a mockery of charity. That's not what charity is all about. And you're absolutely correct. What Jesus wanted to do was change us from the inside out, obviously. And let's talk about Jesus himself, this whole idea that he might have been a socialist. Now, it's interesting because in my article, I quoted this Professor Peter Dreyer from Occidental University or Occidental College, whichever one it is. And he was trying to make the case that Jesus was a socialist. But in making this case, he could only cite two little parts of scripture, two quotations. And one was Luke 12:15. This is very interesting. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Okay, now that's absolutely true. I don't think anyone would disagree. And by the way, devout Christians, for that reason, tend to be less materialistic than other people. But there's something very ironic here and delicious. Professor Dreyer, when he pointed this out, did not provide the context in which Jesus made that statement. What happened was this. A man came to him and implored him to tell the man's brother to share his inheritance with him. That's what the man was asking of Jesus. So in other words, he wanted some redistribution of wealth. And that's when Jesus made this statement. So Jesus there obviously was not interested in economic equality or financial equality at all. He was talking about deeper issues. He was talking about changing hearts and minds and purifying souls. And there are two other stories that I pointed to in my article that I think really illustrate the point well, Gary. There's one part of Scripture where a young man comes to Jesus and he says, I've been following all the commandments, and I'm sure he was, What do I need to do to even be better? And Jesus said to him, well, if you would be perfect, give all you have to the poor and follow me. And the man went away crestfallen. He was fairly wealthy, we understand. That was just too much for him. Okay, someone might say, well, that sounds a little socialist. But then again, let's contrast this with another biblical story, the one of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Now, Jesus was being seen by Zacchaeus, who was up in a tree. Zacchaeus was excited to see him, and Jesus called him down, right? Now, remember, tax collectors back then were held in very low esteem, just like today, but back then they were even worse because they were corrupt. They were taking some of the taxes that they collected for themselves. Anyway, Jesus, though, treated this man kindly, and he said, Zacchaeus, I must come over to your house. And Zacchaeus apparently was transformed because he said to the Lord, he said, I'm going to give half of what I have to the poor, and if I've cheated anyone, I'm going to compensate him fourfold. And Jesus apparently was very satisfied with that. But wait a second, we see a huge disparity here. In the case of the young man, Jesus was saying, give away everything you have. In the case of Zacchaeus, another rich man, probably richer, he was saying, what you're doing is fine, giving away half your riches, which no doubt would have left him still a very wealthy man. What was the difference? Well, for one thing, Gary, we can assume that maybe Jesus was calling on the young man to become what we'd call a priest, but also this sends the message that people in society have different roles and corresponding to that, sometimes different bank roles. Jesus, again, there was demonstrating that he's not interested in some kind of worldly equality. He's not interested in any kind of financial or economic leveling. No, not at all. That really does tell the tale, don't you think?
Well, I think so, absolutely. And it's very clear for anyone who's willing to look, to read the Bible and to look at history, to recognize that we're not talking about socialism, that the voluntary giving of one's wealth to another is not the same thing as the government putting a gun to your head and forcing you to do so. And of course, that someone begs the question, why therefore do socialists and communists identify Jesus as one of their own?
Well, again, because they're trying to market something that has failed for almost 2 centuries. And let me point out something else, because we don't want to forget this. Perhaps the most fundamental difference between socialism and Christianity is that socialism is avowedly anti-Christian, avowedly anti-religion, whereas Jesus, of course, even if you don't believe he's God, you understand that he was the quintessential religious figure. I mean, Marx called religion the opium of the masses, and Lenin echoed that. He said a number of bad things about religion. He said,
well, the communists are atheists, and some people may wonder, someone, well,
yeah.
Gee, are we comparing apples to oranges by talking about communists and socialists as if they're the same thing? But they really are. And of course, one piece of evidence of that is the Communist Manifesto, prior to its publication in 1848, was originally entitled the Socialist Manifesto. But at the time, and of course that was before the many crimes that were committed by these totalitarians under the banner of communism, at the time, the people behind this conspiracy, which is really what it was, thought that they would accomplish more by calling it a communist manifesto as opposed to a socialist manifesto. But communism and socialism have always been the opposite of Christianity. Christianity and communism are incompatible. So is it just marketing that communists and socialists would call Jesus one of their own, or is there more to it than that?
Well, remember, this is not the first time this has happened. I've mentioned this to you before. The Nazis did the same thing. They tried to co-opt Jesus and Christianity. They called it positive Christianity, and the idea behind that was that Jesus was some kind of Nordic character who was persecuted by a Jewish establishment. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you want to replace religion, what you first do is you co-opt it and you water it down and you render it meaningless, and then you can step into the breach.
Yeah, and
but
I
let
think
me point
that's
out something here.
I think that's the key, Selwyn. Because obviously there's a war against Christianity, and that war is waged by communists and socialists. And they recognize that to destroy Christianity, which of course they never could accomplish, but but they're still going to try. They recognize that in addition to the overt attack, they can also try to destroy Christianity from the inside, even to the point of becoming ministers or becoming priests, to destroy Christianity that way. And certainly to call Jesus a socialist is to try to transform Christianity, to try to replace the gospel of Jesus with the gospel of Karl Marx.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that in China today. I mean, China has its own approved bishops, correct? They're trying to control Christianity. And let me just say, though, to close the loop on this, Gary, what our perspective should be. I also mentioned this in my article. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Screwtape Letters, which is written from the point of view of a couple of demons, one of which is schooling the other in how to corrupt a man's soul, he pointed out that what you want to do if you want evil to prevail is you want people to view Jesus as something worldly, as the first liberal, or as the first socialist, or as the first this or that, as long as people don't first and foremost view Jesus as God, then the task has been accomplished. So even people, again, who aren't very religious, who may not believe in Jesus' divinity, most of them will understand that Jesus' mission was not a worldly one. It transcended that. He was not the first liberal or first socialist or first capitalist or first libertarian or first anything. We believe that he was God. And for sure, he wanted to work on changing people through hearts and minds. And as I said before, he wanted to purify their souls. Because if you do that, then all the other things, all the worldly things tend to fall into place. How does that hymn go? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you.
And I think that's a good place to stop. Selwyn, thank you so much for joining the program. God bless you. And for our viewers, we urge everyone to read Selwyn's article in the April 10 issue of the New American Magazine entitled, Was Jesus a Socialist?
They say I'm part of a global plan. I don't think so. It's too hot, it's too cold. You know what? The weather changes.
Here's the news, Dad.
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days.
Ditch the fake news and always get the truth. Go to thenewamerican.com.